Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Kjetil Tronvoll. I think most of our viewers will know you, Kjetil, but just in case, he's a professor at Oslo New University, but more importantly for us, he is a researcher on Ethiopia and on Eritrea and on the Horn of Africa, has written a lot of books on Ethiopia and Eritrea and papers, and I invited him on today to help us make sense of what is happening between Ethiopia and Eritrea today. Most of you will have noticed that there is a feverish recrimination and counter-recrimination and accusation and counter-accusation between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And a lot of the things that Ethiopian officials and Eritrean officials say seem to revolve around some core issues. One of them is the border issue between Ethiopia and Eritrea, or between Ethiopia and Tigray. The other one is the issue of the port, and the other one is the whole issue of Eritrean independence. Some Ethiopian officials seem to put that into question. And who better to ask about this matter than somebody who has written about this, who really knows in detail about these things. And the purpose is to help us to give us the historical knowledge, so that at least people have an understanding of what is happening here. So that is the purpose, the aim, Kjetil, and welcome to Kjetil.
Thank you. I'm happy to try to clarify some of these issues from my point of view.
We will be happy to hear what you'll have to say about this, because I think they are very important. I think one of the things that I find interesting about Ethiopian discourse is that most of the things people say seem to they don't come from a position of knowledge, really. There is a lack of knowledge of historical events or how things transpired, and I think it would be a great deal of help to a lot of people to give them that historical knowledge. So I'm going to rely on stuff that you have written about, stuff that maybe that you have forgotten now, so you shouldn't be under any pressure to recall detailed facts, but I think you will still remember the spirits. So maybe we could begin with the border issue, especially in light of the fact that it's 25th anniversary now, and the European Union and the Americans issued statements saying that it should be respected and implemented. And maybe we could begin with you telling us how the Border Commission in 2000, I think, came about the decision, and what the core provisions of the decision are, and why it has remained a very, very controversial subject between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Yeah. Well, the so-called Algiers Agreement, which had its 25th anniversary last week, came about as a comprehensive peace agreement, as it was called, between Eritrea and Ethiopia after the 1998-2000 war. The war was fought intensely during certain periods of time, and the last offensive in May 2000, the Ethiopian forces managed to breach the Eritrean defense lines and entered both the western lowland but also the highland area of Eritrea. And Eritrean troops withdrew in disarray, and some of the controversy, some of the, different arguments, so to say, but part of the Ethiopian armed leadership and part of the TPLF leadership wanted at that time to continue the offensive in Eritrea to reach Asmara, to actually to topple Isaias Afwerki at that time. But they were stopped by Meles Zenawi and said that, we have no intention to reclaim Eritrea. We just want to reclaim the territories which Eritrean forces had occupied then when Eritrea attacked Ethiopia in 1998. It is clear, just to say that from the start, that there were the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the Algiers Agreement, they decided on 2 institutions to follow up on to make a comprehensive agreement after the war stopped. One was the Border Commission, as you mentioned, which was staffed by international jurists, but the second one was the Eritrean Ethiopian Claims Commission, which were supposed to adjudicate compensation for the destruction of the war on both sides of the border. And the Claims Commission firmly established that the first military attack was from Eritrea to Badme in then controlled by Tigrayan administration in Ethiopia. So when then the Ethiopian government at the time said that, you know, we have reclaimed our territories initially taken by Eritrea, we stop the offensive, and we ask for an international involvement, particularly by then the African Union or OAU at that time, to help draft then a comprehensive peace agreement. The peace agreement then, the Algiers Agreement, where both the leaderships of Eritrea and Ethiopia were present during the negotiations, decided upon that the border, which was, you know, presented as the key reason for the outbreak of the war, the contestedness of the border, where, you know, where certain territories where they belong to Eritrea or Ethiopia. Then it was decided that it should be established in a boundary commission staffed by high-level respected law jurists appointed by each side, and that this commission were bound to decide and to delimitate the border based on colonial treaties of relevance solely. They should only relate to colonial treaties of relevance in deciding where the border should be delimited. And that is the key issue. I have argued earlier that Meles Zenawi, which basically decided this on behalf of the Ethiopian government, upon advice obviously by his legal counsels in the foreign ministry and so on, he thought that this was the appropriate foundation to base a decision on. He strongly believed that Ethiopia would come out favorably after interpreting the old colonial treaties. During that period, I was very critical as an anthropologist. I had worked and lived and done fieldwork in the border areas between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and I knew the ambiguities of the borders, but I also knew the ethnography of the borders, that which then, you know, local identities, local affiliation and allegiances, trade routes, political identities, all these localized issued in the frontiers between Eritrea and Ethiopia were disregarded as not relevant to include in a border demarcation decision. It should only be based on historical treaties and maps. Ethiopia at the time, since they practically won the war, they could have dictated the premise for the negotiations and the peace agreement. They choose not to. They said, we are happy with the fact that only treaties and old maps should be considered. That has been the contestation later on, when then the Border Commission decided that the initially contested territory of Badme, the plains of Badme and the village of Badme, were then the Badme village were given to Eritrea, although Ethiopia had administered it since Eritrean independence, but also earlier. But more concerning for many is also that the territory of Irob, large part of the territory of Irob in central eastern Tigray, also fell to Eritrea. And Irob is a small minority group in Tigray, and they have identified as Ethiopians throughout history, not as Eritreans. So that was also a great concern, which we still see today, the treatment of the Irobs after the recent war in Tigray, and how Eritrea has reclaimed that territory by force. That after the decision, which was in 2001, and you had at that time a UN peacekeeping force on the border, Ethiopia initially said that we respect the decision by the Boundary Commission, but we want to have dialogue with Eritrea and the Commission on how that decision should be implemented on the ground. The delineation was on the map, electronic maps, but Ethiopia argued that in order to incorporate the local concerns and local geography, we need to have a bit flexibility on how it should be demarcated on the ground. That a border should not cut through a village, it should circle the village, it should follow the terrain as much as possible, mountaintops or rivers, riverbeds or whatever, in the way of having a border which is more practically demarcated and more practically operational on the ground. That was rejected by Eritrea, by Isaias Afwerki. He said that no chance, it should be demarcated exactly as it is delimited on the map. And thenceforth, it was never implemented because Ethiopia insisted on a more practical orientation of implementation, whereas that was rejected by Eritrea. Later on, I think it was in 2008 actually, Meles Zenawi confirmed again in a letter to the UN Secretary General that Ethiopia also agrees on a full implementation as is, which was never again picked up and actually implemented on the ground. And as you know, since 2000 it has been a cold war between Eritrea and Ethiopia until the coming of Abiy Ahmed in 2018. So that is part of the original context of the Algiers Agreement. It should also then be mentioned that recently arguments that the Algiers Agreement have de facto and de jure been nullified because Eritrea, well, Ethiopian side argues that Eritrea has broken the premises of the Algiers Agreement by involving itself in destabilizing Ethiopia, and more recently by involving itself in the onslaught on Tigray and other activities along the border. More recently, statements also from Ethiopian officials say that since Eritrea currently, as we speak, is actually occupying parts of Ethiopian territory in Tigray, which was not granted to them by the Border Commission, that in itself indicates that Eritrea has nullified the Algiers Agreement. It is not 100% clear to me whether the official statement of the Ethiopian government today is actually that the Algiers Agreement is defunct or not, but they have signaled it, they have alluded to it on several occasions. But whether or not that demands actually an active government statement lodged with the UN saying that Ethiopia withdraws from the Algiers Agreement and considered it as void. I don't think that has happened.
You mentioned some interesting points, historical points that are really relevant for what is happening today, and we'll come back to the position of the Ethiopian regime later, because the positions, although they tend to equivocate between different positions, they do have some. They come from some historical understanding of what happened. But the first point that I want to explore with you, Kjetil, is you said that Meles thought Ethiopia would come out favorably out of the border commission decision. I wonder why he thought he was under that impression. I ask you that because he knew that it was going to be based on colonial rulings from the 1906 and 1910, and I was really fascinated by a map that you have in your book that shows 3 separate colonial agreements. One from 1900, I believe. I might be wrong on the exact years. Another 6 years later, 1906, and another one 4 years later, 1910. But the point in general is that the map is different according to the 3 separate maps. I mean, the delimitation is different. In one, Badme belongs to Eritrea. In the other, it belongs to Ethiopia. And Meles and people around him should have known that the boundary commission would use any of these maps, and that it would come up with a decision that eventually did. So exactly that map. I think that is a fascinating map. So why did Meles think, and maybe apparently the people around him who were giving him advice, that number one, basing the decision on colonial treaties was the best, and number two, that Ethiopia would come out favorably according to that framework?
Well, I cannot say for certain why he believed it, but I know he believed it because I was not inside his head at that time, and I didn't have the opportunity directly to consult with the legal counsel that the Prime Minister used, which I know was the MFA department in Addis, where they then, as you said, there are 2 agreements which defined the borders on the main contested area of Badme Plains, from 1906 and from 1900.
Exactly.
And the 1900 agreement, which also was between the Italian colonial administration and the Ethiopian imperial court at that time, gave the whole Badme Plains, including Badme village, to Ethiopia. But then a subsequent agreement in 1906 between Italy and Ethiopia redraw that border quite radically, where then half of the Badme Plains, or 2/3, went to Eritrea, including then the village of Badme. And I think, that was the newest, most recent agreement, and I think that's the most valid agreement then used by the Border Commission. Why Ethiopia misunderstood or didn't actually investigate properly enough before they agreed on the premises for the Border Commission's work, that's a relevant question, obviously, but, well, they didn't. They firmly believed they had the right to these territories according to colonial treaties, but they didn't do the groundwork properly enough, as they should have probably before they accepted the premises for the negotiations.
Well, I should probably mention an important detail, that the 1910 agreement was kind of done unilaterally by Italy. Ethiopia wasn't quite involved. So it's very difficult to say that was a colonial treaty between Ethiopia and Italy. I think the one from 1906 was, insofar as Ethiopia could be said to have had the power to negotiate on equal terms. But that was the context.
and these are the points which Ethiopia probably considered at that time, in 2000. The fact that many of these colonial treaties was drafted by the colonial power and kind of presented to Ethiopia as, take it or leave it. And there are also cases where the international version, English or Italian, differs from the Amharic version. And Ethiopia signed the Amharic version believing that was the valid one, whereas Italy signed the international agreement version, which later became the authoritative agreement. So yeah, there is a lot of ambiguity on how these agreements were both drafted and signed and accepted by Ethiopian state party at the time. Certainly so, yeah.
But also there's a wider point you made, which is that you said Ethiopia after the war, Ethiopia was in a position to dictate the terms of whatever kind of agreement with Eritrea, whether it be the border or even the toppling of the regime. And as you know, one of the accusations that a lot of Ethiopians have against Meles was that Meles was lenient towards Eritrea, that he was in a position to, number one, impose strict conditions on the agreement because of the military power that existed then. And that if he wanted, he could have gone all the way and toppled the Eritrean regime and return the Assab port. Maybe we return to the issue of port, but that he, for some reason that nobody has explained, he didn't go as much as his military power would have allowed him to go. Do we have a sense of why Meles was hesitant to do the thing that many Ethiopians say he should have done?
Well, you have to keep in mind that both the outbreak of the war and the way Meles stopped the war in June 2000 almost led to his downfall internally in TPLF, because that was the basis for the subsequent TPLF dissent process, which more or less unraveled the party or split the party in 2001, where key figures in the TPLF leadership and top generals were then thrown out of the party, as you remember. And they almost managed to vote Meles out of power internally in TPLF because of his leniency against Eritrea before the outbreak of the war, and certainly also as a criticism on why he stopped the war when Ethiopia had a military advantage. And many in the military leadership and political leadership of Ethiopia wanted to pursue Eritrean troops beyond the border, so to say. Why Meles did it, I was not inside his head at that time. It can be interpreted as very principled stand, which I admire, in the sense that he clearly wanted to show internationally also, but also nationally, that he respect the international relations. He respected the sovereignty of Eritrea, and he didn't want to pursue other political goals beyond what he initially said was Ethiopian territories. The dissenters or his opponents at the time and today claim that it's because of his background, it's because of whatever, that he was more sympathetic to Eritrea than to Ethiopian interest. I don't necessarily believe that, of course, but that's also part of the argument. It depends on which how you view him as such, which stand you do have. But certainly at the time he came out as a very principle-based decision maker, and that was respected internationally. And again, he might have regretted it later when the decision of the Boundary Commission was in the disfavor of Ethiopia. But then it was too late, so to say. But my principle that Ethiopia could have dictated more of the framework of the peace agreement, I still believe is valid in the sense that they did have the military upper hand, and they could have enforced it either on the ground or through then the Algiers mechanism.
Yeah, so it remains a mystery as to why they didn't push for that, and why they were not insistent on getting some at least basic things, especially a favorable arrangement when it comes to the border. And maybe if you could do all.
You know, they couldn't decide the border unilaterally, but they could have decided the premises of what to be considered as
Exactly. So they could have, for instance,
evidence.
suggested they could have suggested the ethnographic
for instance, political
basis that
lineages,
you mentioned, which would have made sense.
geography.
Exactly. So, because in the book you write, for instance, about the Arab that they have always identified as Ethiopians, and the Ethiopian government could I don't know why I keep forgetting the year, when the boundary commission was being set up.
In Algiers Agreement,
Exactly. The Ethiopian government could have said it matters what the Arab people say. And whatever decision is going to be taken should take into account what the people along the border think. But there was none of that. And it defies belief that even though they had the military superiority, even though they were in a position to impose whatever kind of conditions they thought was favorable for Ethiopia and for Tigray, they didn't. And it's something that I deserves explanation, but none of the TPLF people that would have explained is alive today, so it's a bit of a moot point in a way, because I think the current leadership in the TPLF.
Some of the key figures are still alive, so you should pursue them definitely.
Yes.
Who were part of that process?
Probably, but anyway, just in terms of its implementation, as a matter of routine, they all say that they, in principle, accept the ruling, and that where they have issue is in its implementation. And it was interesting reading the UN documents about the clauses of the agreement and all that. And there is a clause that says that if there is logistical problem in implementation, either party could appeal and the UN could intervene in its implementation. And I thought, for instance, the fact that if the agreement was to be implemented as it is written now, that it would create huge problem, for instance, among the Arabs and among communities that live together for thousands of years. That would be one logistical problem that the UN should intervene. But I don't hear any such kind of discussion. It is as though the way people talk about it is as though a line could be drawn and that would be the end of the story. So I want to get your thoughts on how do they envisage, when I say they, the TPLF, the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, the UN and the other bodies, how do they envisage that it would be put on the ground?
Well, as physical border markers, poles, it was envisioned that they should traverse the border and mark it physically on the ground. And that, when it comes to the logistical challenges, it was basically the challenge of climbing that mountain hill or crossing that river, so to say, to mark where the border should be. Not the more ethnographic logistical challenges. That was not considered as relevant again. So it was a pure physical marking of the border on the ground, which was envisioned, and never took place.
And another,
it has to be told that the Boundary Commission tried to do it. The UN tried to do it, but and also they tried to demarcate the stretches which was not contested, so to say, which both sides agreed upon fully. This is where the border should go. Okay, then let's start with demarcating it on the ground on those parts of the border. That was also denied by Eritrea. They said that we have to have a full compliance initially, then we can go ahead to do the physical work on the ground.
Well, another interesting and often forgotten fact in relation to the ruling of the Boundary Commission is that according to the ruling, as much land would come to Tigray as Eritrea would take from Tigray. I think this is something that people don't make because they focus on Badime for its symbolic importance and all that. But if it was to be implemented as it is, Tigray would also take land from what is now in Eritrea.
True.
So is the position of the Eritrean regime that they would be happy with that? Do they mean that when they say they would be happy to implement the ruling?
I think so, because they have insisted on doing it as is. You have to remember that all focus after the Boundary Commission decision, all focus was on Badme and Badme village, because that was the initial site of the first invasion from Eritrea, and that was what the symbolic content of the whole war was put into the Badme village. And we hardly speak about any other territories. In Afar, for instance, there are territorial stretch in Afar which would have changed sides if it was implemented as is. So this to me indicates, again, as we argue in the book, that the war wasn't about the border. The war was about something else. Yeah? But its symbolic representation through the village of Badme kind of created the whole crux of that matter, that this was a border war, which it wasn't. It was a political power war, it was an economic war, it was a social development war before it was a border war.
I will bring it forward to the year 2018 and 19, because then you wrote an interesting article on, should we say, the peace rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea and the people-to-people reconciliation along the Tigray and Eritrea border. And you make this interesting point that although it didn't matter for the people where the state border lay, they were happy to bridge that imaginary line. It didn't matter to them. That the Eritrean regime was hesitant even then to allow people to come to Tigray, that they did all sorts of obstruction and hindrances to prevent that from happening until it was later officially closed. Why is the Eritrean regime generally scared of the border being open?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I started a project together with colleagues and friends at Meles University and also later Algiers University to try to understand the local cross-border dynamics before Abiy came to power, 2016 to 2018. We worked on that because we saw that people on the ground on both sides wanted to reconnect. These are both socially close, they are intermarried with each other, but also economically close. They do cross-border trade and visit each other's marketplaces and so on and so forth. And we saw that it started to pick up again, despite the fact that the Eritrean regime tried to control it and tried to restrict it. On the Ethiopian side, it was open. Eritreans were welcome to come in to trade at the markets in Zalambesa or other sites. We saw it clearly then after the official rapprochement in 2018, the summer. The border on the ground didn't open up until I think it was the 13th of September or something, 14th of September 2018. Local initiatives wanted it to be opened earlier, and I was there present in the first week of September when the Zalambesa community invited to a reconciliation festival, and they had invited Eritreans to join them, Eritreans from the neighboring villages and also from Senafa, isn't it? Yeah. So, and they were expecting a big delegation from Eritrea to join them, but it was stopped again by the Ethiopian regime and the Ethiopian military. They were not allowed to cross. Until the next week, when the formal opening was there, when, both Isaias and Abiy Ahmed presided over kind of the opening on the ground. back to your question, why is Eritrea hesitant? Well, I think the answer lays also in how Eritrea acted subsequent to the opening of the border, because the border was open only from mid-September 2000 until 30th of December 2020, sorry. 2018.
2018, yeah.
From September to December. Only 3 months. Then Isaias closed the border again on the ground. They were not allowed to cross into Tigray. So it was only a few weeks window of openness on the ground. Why is it so? Why did Isaias close the border again? And I think talking to local people in Tigray at the time, talking to people coming across, assessing the discourse, I think probably the main reason why it was closed again by Isaias Afwerki is that the Eritrean regime lost control of the narrative of what Tigray was and what Tigray had become. Because the Eritrean regime has presented Ethiopia and Tigray as a land of confusion and underdevelopment and misrule. But when Eritreans arrived in both Adigrat and Mekele, they saw, what I was told by them, that, this is a remarkable development. Last time we visited Adigrat, there were only 2-story houses. Now suddenly there are 15 stories, hotels and buildings. Last time we visited Mekele, it was just a small town. Now it is a bustling city. So they saw that during the 20 years of disengagement, Ethiopia and Tigray had developed radically. Eritrea was still standing still. And hence, the Eritrean regime lost control of the narrative of what Tigray and Ethiopia had become. So they needed to close it down again, quickly, before too many people fled. A lot of Eritreans fled and settled then in Tigray and Ethiopia. Because it was, they were free to move, they were not shot as they had earlier. The earlier border patrols of Eritrea had the order to shoot, to kill if Eritreans were fleeing the country. Suddenly it was open and they were allowed to move freely. Okay, they moved across and didn't go back to Eritrea. That was also a valid issue, which then the Eritrean regime, had to stop, so to say, the migration out of Eritrea. But I think more interesting is the fact that, the presentation then suddenly that Tigray was the land of affluence compared to Eritrea. A lot of Eritrean traders came to buy up, as you might recall, foodstuffs, flours, equipment was not from Tigray and shipped it back to Eritrea because they lacked basic commodities in Eritrea at the time, which they could find on the market or in the shops in Tigray. And that was, of course, undermining the whole development agenda, undermining the whole ideology of PFDJ after independence, that, we haven't developed. We have stood still for 30 years. What's happening? And that kind of criticism which was starting to then flourish among the Eritreans who went back and forth to Tigray and Ethiopia. So he needed to stop that.
Yes, and as you know, that skepticism of the Eritrean regime to the people-to-people relation is relevant today, because as today in Tigray, the TPLF is selling this whole idea of what they call sumdo. I don't know what we should call it in English, alliance, maybe partnership, maybe marriage of convenience. I don't. But the context for the word is that in Tigray, because it's ox plowed agriculture, as you know. If you are a farmer and has only one ox, what you do is you partner with your neighbor. So you contribute one ox each, and you have two, and you could do your business. So you take turns and you plow your fields like that. So that is where the word comes. So there is an implied exactly.
There is binding the two oxen together.
It's the fact that you are doing that is called sumdo, and the implied connotation here is that it is a partnership of convenience. It's not necessarily of love. So I don't know if that is what the TPLF is saying. But anyway, the worry that some Tigrayans have is that Isaias might be taking Tigrayans in for a ride again. Because if he was very skeptical about it in 2018, why would he all of a sudden be happy with it now?
Yeah, but Simdo, as far as I understand, can also be a term used for engagement, as in proposal for engagement to marry in parts of Tigray. So it can also, as you say, be a love affair, not only an enforced kind of pairing of two oxen. I certainly think, is it one person, everybody, anybody in Tigray, Ethiopia, or the world should be extremely skeptical to trust it is Isaias Afwerki, because he has shown over and over and over again that his only interest is his self-preservation and the preservation of an Eritrean state in his image. That's it. And we know on record that from the early 1990s, or even during the War of Liberation of Eritrea and the resistance of TPLF, he has been extremely critical to TPLF, the TPLF ideology, and also the TPLF leadership. And since 1991 and 1993, the formal independence of Eritrea, he's also articulated that quite clearly. And certainly since 2000 and the Algiers Agreement, he has looked upon TPLF as its main enemy, and also the Tigrayan people. And we saw that again in during the war, 2022, the way the Eritrean regime legitimized and justified genocide on Tigrayans. So that he has changed his mind over the last year, that suddenly Tigrayans and TPLF are his best friend, well, that's pretty naive to think. Obviously he hasn't. It is an alliance of tactical stature. It's not a strategic alliance, as far as I can see. It is a tactical alliance viewed both from Asmara and Mekele, in my view. And that can be fair enough, but people should understand that it's purely tactical. And as soon as their joint enemy is defeated, they will turn on each other again. That's also obvious. Because so far we don't see any plan articulated either from Asmara or Mekele on a strategic value of this alliance. If that can be presented and bound by both parties, well, then we can discuss it. But now it is purely a tactical alliance, and that should be made clear.
Well, I mean, for what it is worth, my view in relation to the border and the boundary is that, well, maybe this is too much to ask for the Tigrayan political leadership now because it's broken, as you know, but that they should ask for a complete renegotiation, because first it was, like we discussed, it was premised on extremely shoddy colonial treaties. And even then, the Ethiopian government didn't seem to have understood what they were doing. And at any rate, as you mentioned, I don't know how credible it is, the Eritrean regime has breached it by invading Tigray and causing all the damages. So that would be my view. But then, who am I?
That my argument on the latter issue there is not my position. It is the Ethiopian government's position.
Yeah, I hear you.
And it has to be investigated legally. I don't think it necessarily has the legal foundation strong enough to make the Algiers Agreement defunct. And as you said, the UN Secretary General, the EU, the US, all international Western partners at least has reconfirmed their support to the Algiers Agreement over the last 2 weeks. Pretty naively, obviously, but they have to show a symbolic gesture to the validity of the Algiers Agreement. The Algiers Agreement, as I see it now, will not be. It has never been fully implemented, and it will not be fully implemented in the future either. So I think political events on the ground will overtake it and redefine the new agreement later on. I don't think even though Ethiopian government might, well, it is up to the Ethiopian government to present a valid legal political argument strong enough then to gain an international recognition that the Algiers Agreement is defunct. I haven't seen that yet. Of course, it is interesting to see how insisting Eritrea has become to revisit the Algiers Agreement, which they have, you know, it's not that many years ago Isaias Afwerki was in Addis saying that there are no borders between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Abiy Ahmed is my leader. You know, things change rapidly in the Horn of Africa and even further between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So it is a bit difficult to say what will happen tomorrow, but I think I'm pretty sure that Algiers Agreement will not be implemented tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned Eritrea. I find it interesting that Eritreans always, the Eritrean regime conveniently omits to mention that, number one, according to the Algiers Agreement, they were judged to be the aggressors of the war, which is a significant determination. And for some reason, even people in Tigray don't mention this, that it was Eritrea that started the war in 1998. And the other relevant point is that if the ruling of the Boundary Commission were to be put on the ground, Eritrea would give up as much land as it would take from Tigray. The only reason it appears as though Eritrea won is because it was awarded Badime, which was kind of the totemic representative of the whole thing.
True.
But you also mentioned, and I don't want to keep you bogged down here, but the position of the Ethiopian government is also interesting because, as you said, it's not clear what the Ethiopian government has said. Because if they are pushing for the implementation of the ruling as it is going to be a recipe for another war, because there is no way you could implement that sort of agreement. And it's my belief also, and I think you would agree with me, is that members of the international community, when they issue statements saying that it should be implemented, I think they are saying them mindlessly. I don't think they understand what it would mean on the ground. Anybody who has a rough understanding of what the ruling says and the geography, the ethnographic considerations he mentioned, wouldn't say that the ruling could be implemented as it is. But maybe this is for another time.
Yeah, but hypothetically, Addis could now say, since Tigray, TPLF, and Asmara has kind of come to an understanding, well, Addis said implement the agreement on the ground then, because this is Tigrayan territory which has given away. Let TPLF do it then. And then Ethiopian government can revisit the Afar border, which then mainly benefits Ethiopia, actually. So, because it doesn't hurt Addis if Badman now goes to Eritrea, it will hurt TPLF. Because TPLF have insisted for 25 years that Badman is Tigrayan. So Abiy should say, let Isaias take Badman. I don't care. It's up to TPLF, you can demarcate it there locally. But I agree with you, this is hypothetically, it probably won't happen. And I have said repeatedly since 2001, the Border Commission's decision, and 2003 when it was kind of formally said, this is it, that this is the recipe for a new war. And it still is a recipe for the new war. And that's why I also said that, such highly contested political issues which are founded upon historical, ethnographic, social dimensions should never be left alone to jurists to decide, because they don't know the context. And they will always create an agreement then which will just start a new disagreement and a new war. So again, back to the founding principles of the Boundary Commission, which was wrong.
Well, let's leave the the topic of the border and the boundary, because as you and our listeners will realize, there are a lot of details to be fleshed out and to talk about, and maybe I'll invite you on another time to return to it. But now, in the interest of time, maybe let's proceed to the second point, which is the issue of the port access. And as you will have noticed, almost the entirety of Ethiopian politics is now around that, and sometimes it reaches historical levels. But if you kind of strip it off, it's the nonsense and everything they say. The basic argument from the Ethiopian regime seems to be that in 1993, when Eritrea became officially independent, the Ethiopian government was wrong to give the ports to Eritrea. That is what the whole thing boils down to. And I want to take you back to 1993 because you were there, because you know the context, you know what was happening, you know what challenges the Ethiopian government had and all that. So was the Ethiopian government complacent regarding the ports? Should it have fought more to retain them in Ethiopia?
Well, remember the basic premise which Ethiopian government at that time accepted was that Eritrea had the right to full sovereignty over its colonial defined territory, meaning then that both Assab and Massawa, as the key ports, were sovereign territories of Eritrea. But in the Asmara Pact, as it is called, the first comprehensive set of bilateral agreements signed in late May 1993 between then the sovereign country and the sovereign government of Eritrea and Ethiopia, that defines then in a trade agreement component of that Ethiopia should be allowed to use Assab as a free port, and also Massawa to the north, but mainly that Assab should serve as Ethiopia's port of import and export. In addition to, for instance, then the use of the oil refinery in Assab, which basically was an Ethiopian oil refinery, which then should secure Ethiopia's interest for using Assab as a commercial port, not as a port of sovereignty. It was still Eritrean. It's still Eritrean port, but Ethiopia should have the usufruct rights to the port, so to say, defined then by subsidiary agreements when it comes to operational logistics and so on. But that understanding was then breached in 1998 when the new war started. And then since 1998, Ethiopia has been restricted from using Assab by Eritrean government. So it is, and what we've seen later on, which was key in Abiy Ahmed's early tenure, when he came to power, one of the first things his government did was to start to renegotiate with Eritrea again on the use of the port and on trade agreements. And that interest has been there, also kind of underpinning Abiy Ahmed's government in this regard.
Oh, I hear what you are saying, but the pushback, if I could put it that way, from many Ethiopians to that would be to say that in the TPLF dominated government in 1991. We say EPRDF, but I think it's open knowledge that it was the TPLF who was in the driving seat. That it was more than willing for Eritrea to go with both ports, and that if the TPLF was really interested in keeping port access, it could, for instance, have made the agreement that you mentioned in the book and the agreement that you briefly mentioned of the continued use of the Assab port, it could have made it more institutional, and probably international observers should have been made privy to it, so that Eritrea wouldn't renege on that agreement in the way that it did in 1998. That would be what people who who have been perennial critics of the TPLF in relation to the port. That would be what they would say.
And you know, I can agree on a lot of what you're saying here, but you have to keep in mind, and that has been the basis of my criticism against how both Eritrea and Ethiopia have operated international relations wise versus each other, because they have never institutionalized their bilateral affairs. Yes, they had the Asmara Pact agreements signed, but those again were never followed up by policy alignment, by subsidiary laws and agreements. As we clearly states also in this book, the fact that two governments in the run-up to the 1998-2000 war, when there were border skirmishes both in both in Afar and in Tigray-Eritrea border, they communicated, Meles and Isaias, with handwritten notes. Handwritten notes, sending back and forth, you know, yeah, we shouldn't do this, what are you doing there, you know. They didn't it was no proper institutional mechanism to communicate between the foreign ministry of Ethiopia and the foreign ministry of Eritrea, or through an international mediating structure. They communicated as there were two, you know, municipal heads or two mayors in two towns saying that, you know, we have some troubles in your neighborhood versus my neighborhood. How can we fix it? This is an indication for me, and that's what I'm still writing on, that both Ethiopia and Eritrea still looks upon themselves as integral parts. Isaias has never looked upon Eritrea as a total separate sovereign entity from Ethiopia. He still believes that he has an entitlement to the Ethiopian realm. He still operates that Eritrea has an entitlement to interfere in Ethiopia because we are part of the same realm. Remember, in 1997, I was doing fieldwork in Eritrea at the time. I remember it vividly. When Ethiopian government Meles finally accepted that, saying, you know, Eritrea is exploiting Ethiopia economically. It was a different exchange rate to the Ethiopian birr in Asmara than what the National Bank of Ethiopia issued in Addis. So Eritrea de facto was siphoning off foreign currency from Ethiopia. Eritrea was buying up coffee in Ethiopia and exporting it formally from Eritrea and cashing in on the revenue on that. And many incidents of economic exploitation of the Ethiopian market done by Eritrea informally. That spurred Ethiopian government. Are you hearing me? I think it is some, yeah. That spurred the Ethiopian government to reissue the birr. Remember? They established a new birr to make the old currency note defunct, which again spurred the Eritrean government to institutionalize the Nakfa. Because until that time, Eritrea had used Ethiopian birr as their currency until 1997. Then Nakfa was introduced, and Eritrea said, we want Nakfa to be on parity with Ethiopian birr, 1-to-1. Sorry, I said this mistake, because first Nakfa was introduced, then Ethiopia said, no, we don't accept parity 1-to-1. It needs to be on the market condition, how the currency should fluctuate versus each other. So hence, Ethiopia introduced a new birr to make all the billions of birr in the Eritrean banks defunct. When Ethiopia did that, mid-September, late September 1997, I was in Asmara at that time, the Minister of Trade in Eritrea said in a public statement to all Eritrean traders, disregard what the Ethiopian government says, you should continue to trade on parity, Nakfa 1, bid 1. We don't care about the Ethiopian government's decision, you continue as is. Again, indicating an entitlement to be part of the economic dispensation of Ethiopia, but also to interfere politically. And likewise from Ethiopia, it has always also had the same kind of opinion that Eritrea is really not alien, it's really not foreign, it's really not separate fully from us. It is also part of Ethiopian realm. Certainly how the current Ethiopian government are talking about it. So this is what I call the terror of intimacy between Eritrea and Ethiopia. You have never really separated into two sovereign entities. You are still kind of entangled in political, economic, social, cultural, historical narratives which bind you together and which keeps you also to interfere into each other's domain continuously. And hence the argument from Ethiopian government today that, as you rightfully say, that the agreement both in 1991 when Eritrea was militarily liberated, but also in 1993 when they were formally separated and obtained its sovereignty, is currently questioned by the Ethiopian government because it was the TPLF who ruled or who dominated both initially in the provisional government of Ethiopia the first few months, but then later in a transitional government of Ethiopia until 1995 when they got the permanent government of Ethiopia. But you have to, and again, this harks back even earlier because EPLF and TPLF came to an agreement during the struggle because EPLF was very critical to TPLF, who initially framed their struggle under a colonial thesis that Tigray was colonized by Abyssinia. And then Eritrea insisted now the only party of struggle entitled to call it a colonial struggle was Eritrea and EPLF. That TPLF had to rephrase or reframe their struggle into then what they did as domination from a unitary, centralizing, authoritarian structure in Addis Ababa. So at that time, TPLF accepted the colonial thesis and that EPLF was fighting to liberate the old Italian colony of Eritrea from the Ethiopian territory. And the colonial map was known, so to say, meaning including both Assab and Masaba, which later then was converted into the formal government policies, both during the transitional period and after. Whether or not the current government of Ethiopia can argue that agreement decided by the transitional government of Ethiopia between 1991 to 1995 and later the precedents of acknowledging Eritrean sovereignty from 1995 until 2018 and to the fall of EPRDF, whether the current government can manage to argue that all this is void and not valid, that we have to restart, to rethink Eritrean sovereignty. That's a great leap, so to say. I haven't seen that argument presented by Addis Ababa henceforth, at least. Yeah.
Well, good that you mentioned your book, Kjetil, Brothers at War, that you co-authored with, was it Takaste Negash? Yes. And maybe if you can show it to our viewers again to the camera, because it's an interesting book is, yes, rich with information. It describes what happened on the days and months leading up to the war. But I was fascinated by the material that you put in the appendices. I think you have about more than 50 pages of them, at least in the digital copy that I have. And some of the material there is correspondences that Meles and Isaias had. And you say that there was lack of institutions involved, and none of the agreement that Ethiopia and Eritrea were making was institutionalized, which is, I think, very relevant point. It's also relevant to what is happening today now. But so one thing that I found really curious there is it is Meles and Isaias corresponding in their private capacities, not as president and prime minister, but in their personal capacity, which is an interesting thing, which is also what Abiy is alluding to when he says he couldn't find the documents where Ethiopian government, Ethiopian ministers, or Ethiopian institutions decided for Eritrea to gain independence, to get recognition, to gain the pause and all that stuff. So that is what Abiy is pointing to. I don't know how credible it is, but that is the point he's driving at.
But there is a cabinet decision, Minister Council decision in Ethiopia on acknowledging Eritrean independence. That's for sure, and it's also lodged in the UN archives. So I don't think he can get away with that. But certainly the lack of institutionalization of bilateral affairs is an interesting observation. But you have to keep in mind that Eritrea is probably, likely, the least institutionalized state in the world. Not even today. It is, they don't have any parliament. They have an non-implemented constitution. The law development is more on proclamation, or it's on decrees, not in fully developed proclamation and laws. And it's a lot of informality in how the Eritrean state operates. Isaias is very reluctant to enter into institutionalized bilateral affairs, as we see with the attempts by Abiy Ahmed's government after 2018 to institutionalize the 2018 peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and then drafting both a port agreement, a macro trade agreement, and a cross-border agreement. Initially drafted that in late 2018, early 2019, and wanted Eritrea to ratify it and to sign it, but Isaias rejected. Already in the spring of 2019, Abiy should have understood that Isaias is not to be trusted, that he has no interest to fully implement or to institutionalize a peace agreement, that he has other objectives with it, since he rejected the ratification of these bilateral agreements already at that time. So, Isaias is strongly opponent of multilateralism, but also strongly opponent of formalized, institutionalized bilateralism. He wants to have full maneuverability based solely on his own whims and wishes and interests. Yeah? So, but going back to your argument then, or the argument of the current Ethiopian government, where they question actually what is a bit surprising and worrying, is that they're actually questioning the right of sovereignty to Eritrea as such, not only Assab port, but the whole of Eritrea.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. Yes. Yeah, but I mean, if you could give me, I don't know, 10 or 20 minutes for us to explore the whole issue of independence and what the Ethiopian government is trying to say. I think is an interesting point that you make, because whether it is the speech from the foreign minister, where they cite your work, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, or Abiy Ahmed or the other officials, really what the one term that they always return to is that it was a historical mistake. Now, sometimes that refers to only the ports, but other times that refers to the whole idea of Eritrea gaining independence. And according to the conception of Abiy Ahmed and his people, it was Ethiopia's gift and grace for Eritrea to gain independence that Ethiopia could have prevented it from happening. That is really what they are saying. So I have two things in mind that I want to explore with you. One, what was the context then in 1991, 1992, 1993? Why is it that it seems, at least with the benefit of hindsight, the TPLF it seemed to be more zealous for Eritrea to become independent than the Eritreans themselves. They were pushing, and I was reading letters that Meles wrote to the UN, really pushing for independence. And it doesn't really make logical sense for a leader of Ethiopia to be that excited about a different country gaining independence. And I think when people, Abiy doesn't make the argument in good faith, so it's very difficult to credit him. But when Ethiopians in good faith make the argument that there was something very, very odd, I think they are onto something. So I want to explore that issue with you. What was Meles thinking and the TPLF is thinking, and why were they so happy for Eritrea to become independent?
Well, this is a complex issue, and you have to look upon it from the perspective of that time in the early 1990s. As I mentioned, EPLF and TPLF agreed upon this before the Derg fell. They agreed upon this during the struggle in the field. They had, I'm writing about that in one of my other books, the War on the Politics of Identity in Ethiopia, how they reached an agreement on the post-Derg framework, so to say. And TPLF at that time, or EPRDF to be correct, they entered Addis Ababa a week after EPLF entered Asmara. So EPLF had liberated Eritrean territories fully, militarily, in May 1991. And then EPRDF/TPLF entered Addis on the 28th of May and toppled then the Derg regime. TPLF/EPRDF at that time were overstretched. Their army and their cadres and their network had full focus on stabilizing Ethiopian territory. Remember, OLF was part of the game as an insurgency at that time. There were several other smaller insurgent groups which were not necessarily aligned with EPRDF, and they needed to focus on territorial and administrative control of Ethiopia. If TPLF, EPRDF at the time would question Eritrean independence, the only thing which would have happened was a prolongation of the war. That then TPLF, EPRDF needed not only to try to gain territorial administrative control of Ethiopia, but they would have needed to fight EPLF militarily. EPLF, which at the time then fully controlled Eritrean territory and had an army which was stronger than TPLF, EPRDF. So that wouldn't have been feasible. TPLF, EPRDF at that time would have lost, basically, that war. And Ethiopia would have been in disarray for years and years without any central government as such. So I think both the ideological acceptance by TPLF prior to taking power in Addis, ideological acceptance of the colonial thesis that Eritrea had the right to secession, had the right to independence and a sovereign status. That was clearly a fundament for TPLF. You can accuse TPLF of a lot of things, as I have done, but they are ideologically anchored in their key decisions. And when it is ideologically anchored, well, then no more discussions. But also the practical, operational, de facto political military security situation at the time would have prevented any kind of questioning of Eritrean independence. So that is quite clear. Not only in hindsight, that that was the premise of the time in the early 1990s. And also the all international actors, US in particular, was very keen on accepting Eritrean independence at the time, because they had accepted that colonial thesis too, and saw that as the only viable, peaceful solution to the Eritrean Ethiopian issue, which had been haunting the international community for 30 years too. It was a 30 years liberation war that the Eritrean fought to gain sovereignty from Ethiopia, and that should not be belittled or discarded. They won it militarily, fair and square, or maybe not fair, but square. So you have to accept that. Then it is a new argument saying that how was the sovereignty processed? How was that implemented? And then we have to assess the transitional period in Eritrea from 91 to 93, and how both Eritrea acted and how Ethiopia acted in that period. Initially, during the War of Liberation, EPLF wanted and said that we are happy to have a referendum after we have gained territorial control and after toppling whatever regime in Ethiopia. We will have a referendum, and that vote will be on 3 issues: full independence of Eritrea, some kind of federal arrangement with Ethiopia, as it was during the federal period, or full inclusion in Ethiopian state, as it had been practiced the last 30 years. Yeah. But when EPLF took control of Asmara and took control of the Eritrean territory, and they were discussing the process of the referendum and how to organize the referendum, suddenly these 3 issues were no longer there. It was only 2 issues: yes or no to independence of Eritrea. Yes to independence is clearly understood. No to independence was not elaborated, was not clarified. What was no? Was it a confederation? Was it a federation? Was it annexation with Ethiopia? It was not explicitly made clear to the Eritrean constituency or to the international audience. It was just yes or no. I was living in Eritrea doing fieldwork from 91 to 93. I followed this process intimately from day one till after the referendum. And I've written a lengthy article about that way back, where I analyzed the referendum campaign and how they organized it and practiced it. And because of the high level of illiteracy, not electricity, but illiterate population in Eritrea at the time, they used color symbols. So a yes to independence was a blue vote, no to independence was a red vote. A ballot paper, red and blue. And they used a lot of imagery, drawings, to explain to the Eritrean population that what the yes vote contained, what the no vote contained, what the yes vote implied was what a no vote implied. So the blue color was associated with prosperity, abundance of harvest, peace, education, flourishing cities, and so on. The no vote, the red vote, was illustrated by continued war, starvation and famine, destitute and destruction, and torture. So, obviously, very clearly, you don't choose a red vote, because then you were voting for a continuation of war and misery. But you choose the blue vote, which was prosperity and peace and harmony and what's not. That influenced the electorate, obviously, but because the Eritrean referendum is the most affirmative referendum in the history of electioneering in the world, with 99.8% voting yes, and with a 99.2% or something turnout, which is ridiculous, obviously, but it indicates that the referendum was both, yes, popularly anchored. The absolute majority of Eritrean people wanted independence. If it had been a neutral campaign where you had a clear distinction between independence, federation and annexation, the three original issues which we vote upon, my guesstimate would be that probably 85% would have voted yes to independence, maybe 10% federation, a trading community, maybe there are some Afars, Kunamas, maybe some of the highland using that, and probably 0.0 for annexation. So there is no doubt the absolute majority wanted independence, but the way the process was manipulated, you can question. Certainly, and I have questioned that in my earlier writing, way back. The control in the Afar, for instance, which has come up again in the context of today with the establishment of the new Afar front, and claiming that Afars have always been Ethiopians, and I think, or always been non-Eritrean, if I can use that term, under their own sultanate, under their own self-administration, and how that self-administration related to the highlands and paid tribute to the imperial reign or whoever, that's a different matter. And I was the only observer, together with one other colleague. We were only 2 international observers in Afar Danak Elia, Eritrean Afar, during the referendum process, during the vote itself. We traveled there alone, navigating by stars and maps, so to say, because there were no roads and so on. And it was clearly visible to me that, because it was a full military mobilization in Afar, in Danakil, during the referendum, because it was speculated that the Arduf, the Afar insurgency at that time, that they wanted to destruct and prevent the referendum to be conducted among the Eritrean Afars. It was a strong opposition existing in 1993. So the EPLF had a full mobilization in Afar territory to control the vote, so to say. And of course that also controlled the vote outcome. No Afar dared to vote no, because they saw that the ballot box itself was guarded by EPLF guerrilla fighter. So, there is a lot of technical issues you can discuss and debate about the conduct of the referendum, but nevertheless the referendum were conducted. It was approved internationally. It was a UN monitored mission. That UN monitored mission you can criticize left, right and center, because they hardly knew whatever was going on the ground, because they were never on the ground, so to say. But still, it was internationally recognized, the referendum process, and after the referendum, Ethiopia, many believe Ethiopia was the first country to recognize international sovereignty of Eritrea, but actually they were the second. US was the first country to recognize Eritrean sovereignty, and then Ethiopia, and then everyone else. It's very difficult to contest Eritrea's right to sovereignty today, based on the process and based on the precedents ever since.
I think that's an important point, and no sensible person would doubt that Eritreans were always going to go for independence if given the opportunity. But of course, as you know, many Ethiopians have a lot of questions, and actually in the Amharic rendition of how the referendum went, the story is that the choice given to Eritreans were between, so in Tigrinya, Netzanet and Barnet. So Netzanet roughly means independence or freedom, and Barnet roughly means slavery. And if you give people option between this, they were always going to choose Netzanet. That is how many Ethiopians would put, but I don't think, I think that is an exaggeration. But the main point, I think the point there is that it wasn't probably the most fair and free referendum. I think there were a lot of shenanigans. I think that I don't think that is in doubt.
No, as I said, the whole process was highly manipulated and controlled by the EPLF. Certainly, the Eritrean Referendum Commission wasn't an independent commission; it was fully controlled by EPLF. You can question why, as we see today, why the electorate was only Eritreans. Why not the electorate was all of Ethiopia? Well, the Ethiopian government accepted that the electorate should only be Eritreans. So
Well,
It should have been
I think it would
discussed
have
at that
been
time.
I think it would have been ironic if having fought for 30 years, the fate of the Eritreans would then put to for Ethiopians to decide, because that's the
It
very
would have been
cold
impossible. EPLF would have
exactly.
rejected it. Yeah.
It would have been
Yeah.
an irony of epic proportions. So that's that. I don't
Yeah.
know why people say that.
But we have to remember already at that time too, Ethiopians questioned the legitimacy of independence of Eritrea. But those voices in Ethiopia were arrested, so to say. They were not allowed to express it or not allowed to rally behind it by the Ethiopian government at the time.
But anyway, just one final point. Another kind of interesting point that Eritreans these days mention when Ethiopians say that Eritrea is not a legitimate independent country, that the way the ports went from Ethiopia wasn't fair. Their kind of retort to that is to say, well, it doesn't matter whether Ethiopia recognizes Eritrea or not. Eritrea is an internationally recognized country, and in the ultimate analysis, Ethiopia could say whatever it wants. It doesn't really matter. That is one thing they say. Another one is what you recognize Eritrea in 1993, and in accepting the ruling of the Algiers Boundary Commission, that is also an implicit acceptance of where the border lies. I wonder if you would like to reflect on the latter point, on the implication of accepting the ruling of the Algiers Agreement, if that means that Ethiopia accepts the legitimacy of the Eritrean state, but also the ownership of the port. Because if you accept where the line should be, which is what Ethiopia would be doing if it accepted the ruling, then you are indirectly accepting the others as well that follow from that.
But I don't think that is a relevant argument, because the sovereignty issue is already settled prior to the Algiers Agreement. And Algiers Agreement is just a bilateral treaty. It doesn't say anything about sovereignty. It says something about border territories and border delimitation, but it doesn't contest any sovereign issues as such. So I think that's a moot argument, actually, to link those two together. It is not relevant. And I can certainly see that Ethiopia, or Eritrea for that matter, they can present argument and justification to contest the Algiers Agreement today, or to nullify it, or to create to make it void and not and redundant, because of post 2000 events. There have been wars after that agreement, and wars generally make prior agreements redundant. That's one of the strategies to nullify bilateral agreements, is to go to war, and then the winner decides a new agreement. But that doesn't question the sovereignty of Eritrea. That's a different matter. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Just I asked you that for completeness, really. But just one final point in terms of the international community, because we have to always mention the international community in connection with Eritrea and Ethiopia, because nothing happens without the go-ahead from different quarters, from the Gulf states and from the Western. The way the Ethiopian government is becoming more and more bullish in its assertions about Eritrea would suggest that it is getting the go-ahead from some quarters. That would be my reading, because I don't think if the Western countries, the Americans, were telling the Ethiopian government, Eritrea is a sovereign country, the ports belong to Eritrea, you couldn't do this kind of bellicosity, I think the Ethiopian regime would have stopped doing that. So it must be getting some sort of succor from some corners. Is that your reading, or how do you generally read the role of the international community in all this? And with that, we're going to end.
Well, I think it is certainly ambiguous. The various relations we do see now entangled into the Eritrea-Ethiopia conflict, because there is a geopolitical context in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea area, which makes the Eritrean Ethiopian conflict much larger than itself. where regional alliances are clearly supporting or buffering these two states. UAE versus Ethiopia, that alliance between the Emirates and Ethiopia is apparently very strong economically, but also security-wise. The latest reported allegedly RSF training camp on Ethiopian territory in Benishangul versus the conflict in Sudan, funded by the Emirates. And you see the more recent, and of course you have the long-term positioning of Egypt assisting Eritrea to destabilize Ethiopia, which have increased radically, the rhetoric at least over the last few months, because Egypt's also contesting the GERD framework. And now more recently Saudi Arabia Eritrea relations, after Isaias was there on the state visit just a couple of weeks ago or last week. Apparently, allegedly, Isaias is inviting Saudi in to manage or control ASAP, which makes a direct contestation then between the Emirates and Saudi over the control of ASAP. Because part of this game is probably also that Ethiopian government has told the Emirates that, you know, we are happy for you to manage the port after we take control of it. Yeah? That's the local, regional dimensions, very simplified, very simplified. But then the broader, more global connections relating to this again is Russia and China and the US as the key actors. Russia, we know, is operating, wanting to have a renewed influence. Again, allegedly, they have brokered a deal with the SAF in Sudan to gain a naval base in Port Sudan, which have been in the making for years and years and years. Finally, SAF then have been forced to accept it, so to say, to get help in their struggle against RSF. And that positions then Russia on the side of Sudan as an opponent then to Ethiopia's interest and Emirati interest in that war theater. China is positioning itself rather neutral in a sense to the whole debacle. US is also appearing to hesitate on which side to follow, and I don't think that will be decided solely on Ethiopia or Eritrea premises, because if it was only on the premise of Ethiopia and Eritrea, US will favor Ethiopia certainly, because they have been a partner in the war on terror, and they're much bigger, they're much stronger, they're much more incorporated into the security complex of US interests in the Horn. But it might more depend on how Egypt and Saudi position itself versus US interests versus Ethiopia and Eritrea. And we know that US has very strong connections, and Trump has very strong connections to, well, US historically very strong connections to Egypt security-wise and otherwise, and Trump has very strong connections to the Saudi royal court personally and investment-wise. So that might more influence US positioning here than what's happening internally in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So that's a bit too early for me, at least, to interpret where US will put their money, who US will put their money behind. I think in general, to move 10 steps back, I think everyone will be happy if Isaias goes. Certainly Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia can never trust Isaias. Isaias have tried to fool Saudi Arabia 3 times already since independence. So I think Saudi knows that he is an extremely unreliable partner to engage with. And the West certainly knows that Isaias is totally bunkers, and we don't want the Eritrean regime to continue, because the Eritreans are fleeing to Europe in droves still. We don't want them to come to Europe. We want them to be part of their homeland as such. And the US, you know, traditionally had no interest in the dictatorship of Eritrea. But with Trump, it might differ a bit. It might be more pragmatic versus Isaias. So I don't think anyone will cry if Isaias is toppled, but it will be a kind of a public shaming of Ethiopia if they go to that extent. But behind the enclosed rooms, they will embrace Abiy and said, "Job well done," to topple Isaias. But the point is that what happened post Isaias, that is the issue. Isaias will die, he's 80 years now next month, yeah? So he will not live forever. And then what will happen to the Eritrean regime, which is so non-institutionalized, which is so based on the premise of one man and his interest and his political power. And that's more concerning both for the sake of Eritrea and Eritrean sovereignty and the welfare of Eritreans inside Eritrea, certainly, but also ramifications in the region as such, which might open up other doors. The paradox, just to end with that, the paradox of the whole issue is that it is such an obvious win-win for Eritrea and Ethiopia to have an agreement of Ethiopia using the Assab port. Assab port has always been the main port of Ethiopia, so to say, with this historical exception since 2000 or since 1998. It has always been the main port of Ethiopia, and geographical wise, it's just very little use for Eritrea, which is Masaba or Tio or other ports which are more catering for the Eritrean population. And Eritrea could earn, well, I think Djibouti cash in about 2 billion, a bit less than $2 billion a year on port fees and tariffs. Eritrea could get at least 1 billion, 1.5 billion, whatever, out of Ethiopia to start with, if they enter into an agreement. And they can even cash up significant more if it is a long-term lease, or whatever. So, and Eritrean population desperately need foreign funding, desperately need development, desperately need peace, definitely needs educational, social, economic benefits which they don't have today. So it is 100% a win-win for both countries to come to an agreement of Assab, but the stubbornness and ideological blindness of Isaias Afwerki prevents that to happen. I put the blame on Isaias because Abiy Ahmed have tried. The government of Ethiopia has tried after 2018 to draft these agreements and presented it together to Isaias for ratification, and he rejects to do it. So, and clearly we have precedents that indicates that Isaias has no interest to help Ethiopia in these matters. And that kind of blinded nationalism which guides Isaias Afwerki at cost of the Eritrean population, to the exact opposite of what the Eritrean population needs and deserves: peace, stability, development. It's a tragedy to see.
Well, fair to say that you're not endearing yourself to Isaias supporters, but
No.
Objectively speaking, everything that you said about Isaias should be uncontroversial among Eritreans. Eritreans would be the primary beneficiaries if Isaias were to go today. I think what you mentioned in terms of the Eritrean refugees, if you go to any immigration centers in Europe, you are always bound to find a disproportionately huge number of Eritreans, and that should be a constant source of shame for Eritreans. There is no reason why that should be a fact of life, and I always find it as a kind of as a source of humiliation even for me, because the ultimate analysis, we are brothers and sisters, but because of the blind nationalism you mentioned, there is a tendency to be to blindly support Isaias and to be resistant to any kind of criticism of him. And another interesting point you mentioned, just to conclude, Kjetil, is in terms of the myriad players in the Horn of Africa. I think that is one big labyrinth, and I think it's a blind spot among Ethiopians. You don't see that discussed. Who are the players? What is happening? Who are pulling the strings and all that? And maybe I'm going to try to find people who have expertise in that area to enlighten our viewers, because that is an important point. Because I don't think the war in Ethiopia and in Eritrea comes entirely out of agency of Ethiopians and Eritreans themselves. I think there are external players. And just final point, if by some magic sensible leaders were to emerge in Ethiopia and Eritrea, I think the Assad issue, the border issues and everything, they would pale into nothing. They are not the most complicated problems to solve. It's just that there aren't sensible people in positions of leadership. And with that, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Kjetil. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
I would always recommend people to read your books, because they contain, and your article, a lot of information, which I think is very important. But I think people need to be informed in how decisions have been made and what is being done and who are the players and all that. So a very good researcher on Ethiopia, somebody that I trust, which is why I every week invite you to come on. And thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And seasonal greetings to you and to everyone.